15. Tuesday, 12th of August, 2025. He wandered through other rooms at another time, early morning, where he would usually rise late if given the option. Locrian had begun waking when the sun was young. A certain quality of the dawn froze time or gave an impression of reversing it, for he found himself in those newborn hours longing most for times past, thinking of people in their time and season, tearful of a day gone by. The bright and joyous sunlight did nothing to avert his gaze from it. If only he'd look forward, he might relish the promise of a new day. The other room, one he rarely perused, his father's bedroom, displayed an innocence of assumption that its inhabitant would return at any moment. A pair of jeans folded over an armchair, a wristwatch laying on the bedside table, the doors of the closet hanging ajar as though they had been left in a rush. The bed had been hurriedly thrown together. Given he wasn't one for visitors, his dad never felt the need to have the house looking too presentable. Near enough was good enough. A dog-eared copy of Vonnegut sat at the nightstand, bookmarked forever at page 134, bringing a wistful smile to Locrian's face. He'd mentioned the book to his father in the past. He'd clearly remembered and thought to read it for himself. "What's wrong, mate? What happened?" "Scared of the thunder. I had a bad dream. Really bad." "Dreams can't hurt you, mate." "What if the lightning starts a fire?" "I promise you it won't." "Can I sleep here?" "Hop in, buddy." Locrian sifted through the nightstand drawers, momentarily forgetting what he searched for. Where a person might keep their will had never been a question he'd considered until now. It would be best for him to leave it to Leah, but he wanted to be helpful and could think of no other way. He gave up on his search and moved to the window, where the morning frost lay thick on the panes. I thank God for another day. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a reply from Leah, although he'd forgotten he'd ever messaged her in the first place. "The house, you're right, it's exactly the same. Still a day away, sorry. Dealing with some stuff at home. See you tomorrow. X." The admission of delay came as a mild shock to his temperament, for he had expected this day to be a busy one, travelling to Queanbeyan to consult their father's solicitor. But now the slate had been wiped clean entirely. A tightness pressed his chest, a sensation of being trapped, of energy with no outlet. He gazed at his hand, lashed in uneven patterns by the thorns of weeds, and gazed at the half-eaten bag of peanut butter pretzels he'd sustained himself on for a day and a half. He would do well to move his body, if only to outrun his mind and remind himself of a physical prowess he still possessed, in spite of the yoke of approaching middle age. He would run somewhere, anywhere, see old sights in the light of a new decade. No matter the miles of experience in his legs, the onset of a long run often proved to be troublesome, and usually left Locrian doubting of his ability to cover any sort of distance. This morning, however, the anxiety to begin was swiftly quashed, and in little time at all, he felt the tingling of sweat overcoming the brisk air that engulfed the bushlands. The road to Captain's Flat was some 10 miles from his childhood home. 16 kilometres made more sense to him, but most of the running influences he'd seen online were Americans speaking an imperial language. And given the day was his to do as he pleased, he thought to fill his hours with an absent productivity. To run such a distance was usually a panacea to the overactive mind, a meditation away from the darkness that shrouded him, that he might outpace the cobwebs that clung and sweat away the fever of unidentifiable dread that surrounded him. His flight on a flurry of aging feet carried him along, a hurrying through frostbite over the unpaved road that would stretch the first 12 kilometres of his pilgrimage. Amongst a warbling of magpies, he felt an opening of his heart, a valve released and a torrent of emotion, neither joy nor sorrow, raced through the rivulets of his veins, for it was both a wonder to be alone and running on his two strong legs, an unbearable tragedy to pilot the remainder of his days without his patriarch. The song of the wild fluted its melodious bell call, past shrill beaks and mottled plume, as the piebald birds parted the grasses for progress in their wanderings. Long were the trails through the thicket, cloyed with wattle dressed as sun, little stars that bloomed among a vagabond sepia. For Locrian, a simpler rhythm of bone on rock, a pressure of puffed breaths forced by footfall from his being, there to hang in heated clouds about his mouth. A sense of clarity settled him, an idea that there was no grief or sorrow, only a reaction to it. Perhaps he could carry on, still feel happiness, remain the benefactor of simple pleasures. Life had led him here to this moment, sought to ferry him over every shoal thus far. So even the approaching sound of a vehicle would not throw off his rhythmic running. That is to say, the echoes of a spluttering engine could never drive a nail of anger through his madness. A drone of ascending volume, a shepherd's tone of irritation, louder and louder, concealed still by trees and distance. No, he would not be swayed. He'd keep running, count his steps with increased difficulty, the mosquito whine of the speeding vehicle pounding louder in his skull. He turned his head to where the sound came from, seeing nothing but the prison bars of tree trunks, but knowing on this narrow road that he'd need to make way for the car to pass, that in turn it would have to acknowledge his existence as pedestrian. He cursed that bellow, the shattering of shale beneath his foot, for he could no longer focus on the ground before him. His anxiety cresting, heart racing, the offending vehicle roared past him, an old Holden ute travelling much too fast for the country road, sending Lockie into the ferns, where he leapt for fear of being struck, the driver shouting some obscenity at him that he could not properly discern, before keeping its pace off into the distance in a cloud of dust. Rage overcame him. He pulled himself to his feet and threw a stone in the direction of the ute that was far off ahead of him already. "Moron!" he shouted. "Slow down, idiot!" Dust gathered on his sweat-covered forearms. The combination of physical exertion and primal fear had his chest pounding erratically. Lockie slowed his pace to a walk and collected his bearings. His watch began to beat, in a beat of warning, to his elevated heart rate. 10.8 kilometres covered. Not far until he reached the town, and soon he knew his path would change to a paved road where he could coast downhill into the valley. It was always those types of cars that were driven so unsafely, their drivers fulfilling their own stereotype. Locrian did his best to quench the anger that mounted inside him, but all he could do was seethe. Death had overtaken him at 6.7 miles and snatched away with it the peace he'd so tenuously cultivated. Try though he might, he couldn't regain that equilibrium. Nobody visited Captain's flat unless they had reason to be there. It gave no reason to stop or pass through, and unless one lived there, it could go by unknown to all bar the most eager of cartographers. The once respectable mining town had been in decline for close to a century. So it was that any person who might have been out in the streets on that late morning might have found it puzzling to observe the running man who jogged into town like a crippled cowboy. There was a small park at the centre of the township, where Locrian sought to quench his thirst at a water fountain and plonk himself down onto a bench. In the stillness of the day, the sun was bleak, held harshly overhead, interrogating, leaving few shadows for anyone to hide. And yet there was nothing to conceal. The daylight shone indifferently on the almost alien landscape of the mines, long closed, the pines that grew jagged from the ochre soil, the cars that stood silently on the street side. The pub was closed on Tuesdays, so said the sign, as Locrian poked his way about in search of respite, feeling about half past dead, and found no one to confirm the town's lifeblood, instead left blind crying in the harsh sun and wishing to be heard. As his body cooled, the foreboding of true isolation draped over him in shivers. Given that he'd need to conserve energy for the return run, he opted against climbing the hill of the old mine to survey the town and instead approached the petrol station with trepidation, as the windows of the general store were black and gave no indication of being open for business. The door opened though, revealing cramped shelves of groceries beneath a lazy ceiling fan. Still, he saw no people, the ceiling fan belying the time-frozen canvas of a certain painterly quality, a movement in lull. Whatever he chose to purchase would need to be a manageable size for him to run home with. He placed a bottle of water on the counter and was startled to see the shopkeeper had been sitting there the whole time, camouflaged against a display wall of cigarette packets. "You're lost," he smirked. "Huh?" "You look lost," he repeated. "Did you run here or something?" "Yeah, sorry, you scared me." "Not much going on today. And then some strange running man shows up in my shop." "Passing through." "Everyone is. You're not from here, I know that much." Locrian wasn't in any mood to talk. "I don't live here anymore. I used to live a few clicks towards Braidwood." "Used to," he said the shopkeeper. "Doesn't belong anymore." Locrian left, bemused, hesitating to drink from the water bottle, fearing that strange man must have poisoned it somehow. He was compelled by an urge to leave, and leave immediately. Another sign thanked him for visiting Captain's flat, his legs beginning to protest at the prospect of running again, the sun at its zenith, the trees towering over him, an insect that must scurry away from the swooping of birds. Although relieved to have left the ghost town in his wake, Lockie found himself unable to reclaim the momentary joy he'd felt when he'd left the house, as though he'd exhausted any positive emotion he might have uncovered within himself. His feet dragged him across the tide of cicadas that screamed without end in the bushland surrounding. Yet they should not have been making such a calamity of sound, Locrian had thought. The day had warmed considerably, but it was unusual for those brash insects to be awake this time of year. An old sandstone church came into view. He had paid it no attention on the way over, and its presence in such isolation presently revived the isolated dread of the town he'd just left behind. Did I remember to thank God for another day? The morning had dragged on forever. He could no longer recall if he'd muttered his mantra. Despite the day having descended into a dour affair, and he concluded that he wasn't terribly thankful at all for it, or how it had played out. Afternoon had crawled onto the property by the time he had arrived home.